At 11:32 on the morning of November 29, 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran knelt in the tail section of a B-17 Flying Fortress named Rikki-Tikki-Tavi, watching German fighters swarm toward his crippled bomber, like hornets closing on a wounded animal. 19 years old, a dairy farm kid from Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. This was his 5th combat mission, and it was about to become the loneliest fight of the entire war. The 8th Air Force had sent over 300 bombers to Bremen that morning, and German defenses had already knocked 6 flying fortresses out of the sky in the first hour alone. Moran's post was the most isolated seat on the aircraft, a bicycle-style saddle wedged in the very tail, 40 feet of fuselage separating him from the rest of the crew, armed with nothing but twin .50 caliber machine guns and whatever nerve he'd brought with him that morning. German pilots had learned early that a direct stern attack put a bomber in the sights of exactly one gunner. Take him out, and the whole rear quarter opened up. By November 1943, the math of survival for a B-17 crew was brutal beyond argument. 25 missions to earn a ticket home, an average crew lasting barely 15. Crews had a name for the deep missions into Germany: milk runs to hell. Moran had enlisted the day he turned 18, trading a life of shoveling manure on the family farm for gunnery school, where he'd learned to track fast movers, fire in disciplined bursts to keep his barrels from cooking off, and identify a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf silhouette at 2,000 yards. Nothing in that training had prepared him for negative 40-degree cold at altitude, or for German pilots who'd been flying this exact kill sequence since 1939. Cripple the engines first, silence the gunners second, then pour cannon fire into the fuselage until something essential gave out. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi dropped its bombs on target over Bremen's shipyards and factories, and for a moment it looked like the hard part was over. Then, on the turn for home, flak found the No. 2 engine dead center. The propeller windmilled uselessly. The bomber began bleeding speed and altitude, falling behind the protective mass of the formation, and a straggler over enemy territory was a marked aircraft. Moran saw them coming. A dozen Messerschmitts climbing from below, a second wave of Focke-Wulfs diving from above, closing on a crippled bomber with no friends left in the sky. If you want to see how Eugene Moran survived what came next, hit that like button. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Moran. The first fighter came in low from 6 o'clock. Moran braced against the steel plate at his back and opened up with both 50s, tracers walking across the attacker's fuselage until the pilot broke off and rolled away. There were more behind him, always more, working in pairs, one drawing his fire while the second lined up the kill shot from an angle he couldn't cover. Brass casings piled around his boots. The guns ran hot in his hands, while his fingers went numb with cold inside his gloves. Cannon fire started finding the aircraft in earnest. Somewhere forward, one waist gunner's guns went silent. Then the second. The intercom dissolved into static, and half-formed words Moran couldn't make sense of. He kept firing anyway, because there was nothing else left to do. A Focke-Wulf came in from 4 o'clock, and he caught it clean. The wing sheared away, and the fighter spiraled down, trailing black smoke. His first confirmed kill of the war. He didn't get to feel it. Cannon rounds tore through the tail section and slammed into both his forearms almost simultaneously, blood soaking through his sleeves before the pain even fully registered. His hand still worked. He kept both triggers pressed. More rounds found the vertical stabilizer above him, snapping control cables that whipped through the compartment like live wires. The whole tail section shuddered under damage it was never built to survive. Moran glanced down at his parachute, the one thing standing between him and a 4-mile fall, and found it torn through with cannon holes, the silk shredded beyond any hope of holding air. Forward in the fuselage, the crew was going silent, one position at a time. Pilot and co-pilot dead at the controls. Flight engineer dead in the top turret. Radio operator, ball turret gunner, both waist gunners, dead. Of 10 men who'd taken off from England that morning, only 2 still drew breath. Navigator Jesse Orison in the nose, and Moran alone in the tail, 40 feet of ruined fuselage between them. One more cannon round found something structural. The airframe lurched, metal grinding against metal until the sound built into a shriek Moran would carry in his skull for the rest of his life. the tail section tearing itself free of the aircraft entirely. He watched the cockpit, the wings, the engines, and every crewmate he had left fall away from him and drop toward the German countryside 4 miles below. He was alone now, sealed inside a severed tail with 2 shattered arms, a useless parachute, and roughly 90 seconds of falling ahead of him by any honest calculation of physics. What Eugene Moran did next made no sense, by any standard of self-preservation. As the wreckage spun end over end, throwing him against the walls hard enough to reopen his wounds, he grabbed the machine guns and kept fighting. The German pilots, curious or triumphant, closed in on the tumbling wreckage to confirm the kill, and flew straight into range of a wounded gunner who hadn't accepted that he was already dead. Tracers arced wildly as the compartment spun. One Messerschmitt took hits across its fuselage and dove away trailing smoke, the pilot apparently unwilling to find out what else the falling coffin had left in it. Physics gave him one small favor. The severed tail's stabilizers caught air like crude wings, slowing the spin and turning a dead drop into something closer to an uncontrolled glide, roughly 100 feet per second instead of straight freefall, still fast enough to kill, but slow enough to leave him seconds he spent firing at anything German that came near. The ground rose to meet him, through gaps in torn aluminum. Fields, forest, farmland, closing fast. The tail section struck the crown of a pine forest at close to 100 miles an hour, snapping branches thick as a man's arm, cartwheeling through the canopy, and shedding metal with every impact, before finally slamming into frozen ground and going still. Moran was alive, barely. Both forearms broken in compound fractures, bone through skin, ribs shattered, a piece of his skull torn away, brain tissue exposed to freezing air. He'd just become one of only 3 Allied airmen in the entire war, confirmed to survive a fall of that distance without a working parachute. Survival meant nothing yet. He was down in a forest near Syke, 15 miles south of Bremen, the city his bombs had just helped set on fire, surrounded by people with every reason to want him dead. German soldiers found him within the hour, searched him roughly without regard for his shattered arms, and loaded him onto a bare wooden cart with no stretcher, no blankets, no medical attention of any kind. He spent 2 days on a concrete floor in a military facility, with no doctor, no medic, infection already setting into his wounds, gangrene creeping into arms gone purple and black. 48 hours, by any medical estimate, was roughly what he had left. On the 3rd day, a different cart carried him to a converted prisoner of war hospital, and there he found the one piece of luck in the entire ordeal. 2 Serbian military doctors, themselves prisoners captured on the Eastern Front, pressed into treating wounded Allied airmen with field instruments and almost no anesthesia. They looked at Moran's case, wrote him off by any rational triage standard, and decided to operate anyway. 7 hours, local numbing agents that barely dulled anything, metal pins and salvaged wire to set the fractures, a crude plate fashioned to cover the exposed section of his skull. When it was over, they told him plainly, the next 72 hours would decide everything, and there was nothing more medicine could do for him. The fever hit that first night, climbing past 104 degrees, his body shaking through chills that soaked him in sweat. The second night was worse. Delirium, calling out for his mother, screaming warnings to crewmates already dead, reliving the moment Riki Tiki Tavi tore itself apart over and over in his own head. The Serbian doctors sat with him in shifts, offering cold cloths and quiet words in accented English he probably never heard, because medicine had nothing left to give him. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Moran opened his eyes, recognized where he was, and understood he'd won a fight no scalpel could have finished for him. Word of his survival moved through the hospital fast. The American who'd fallen 4 miles and lived, the tail gunner who kept shooting as his own bomber came apart around him, and even guards who'd watched hundreds of dying prisoners came by just to look at him. 6 weeks later, he could walk. What followed was 17 months of captivity that tested him in entirely different ways. Transfers by cattle car, packed 60 men deep with no food for 3 days. A hell ship crossing of the Baltic that locked 200 prisoners in a lightless hold for 4 days, with no sanitation, men dying in the dark among the living because there was nowhere else to put the bodies. Then, in February 1945 with Soviet forces closing from the east. German guards force-marched the entire camp west on foot, in 20 below cold. The Black March, 86 days and roughly 600 miles that killed an estimated 1,500 Allied airmen to pneumonia, typhus, frostbite, and guards who shot anyone who couldn't keep pace. Moran, still carrying 2 improperly healed arms and a metal plate conducting the cold straight into his skull, put 1 foot in front of the other for every one of those miles. On April 26, 1945, soldiers of the 104th Infantry Division intercepted the column near the Elbe River, and the German guards simply threw down their rifles. Moran weighed 93 pounds against the 150 he'd enlisted at. Nearly 40% of his body gone to the crash, the surgeries, the camps, and the march. He was alive anyway, one of 3 known Allied airmen in the entire war to survive a fall like his, carrying 2 Purple Hearts worth of wounds, and a service record his own commanders found difficult to believe. He came home to Soldiers Grove in late 1945, married Margaret Finley, and built a life on the same ground where he'd grown up watching airplanes cross the sky and dreaming of flight. He raised 9 children. He rarely spoke about any of it, not to his wife, not to his kids, not for over 60 years, because talking about it meant living it again, and 8 men from his own crew had never come home at all. The silence finally broke in 2007, when Wisconsin named him the first recipient of its Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award. A local history teacher named John Armbruster spent years afterward earning enough trust to hear the whole account firsthand, work that became the book Tailspin in 2022. The same year, navigator Jesse Orison's own surviving testimony helped confirm every detail of that November morning over Bremen. Soldiers Grove named a street after him in 2008, Eugene Moran Way. Eugene Moran died on March 23, 2014, 70 years after German flak cut his bomber in half over enemy territory and sent him falling 4 miles toward the earth, still firing. His obituary carried a line that summed up the man better than any medal citation could. He'd rather wear out than rust out. The loneliest seat on a B-17 belonged to the tail gunner. First target, last to know if the aircraft was going down, and when his came apart around him at 24,000 feet, Eugene Moran didn't stop shooting until the ground finally caught him. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Everyone tells YouTube to put this story in front of more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're pulling stories like this one out of the archive every single week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if anyone in your family served, we want to hear it. Thanks for watching, and thanks for making sure Eugene Moran doesn't disappear into silence.